Hi, this is Leslie Terebesi, and I will be talking to you for the next 10 or 15 minutes about abrogation in Islam. Now, the word abrogation, as you probably know, means cancellation, to make something null and void, something that was previously applicable. Now, this term is applied in Islam in several contexts. One is when it is applied to certain verses that have been allegedly abrogated by other verses, or even certain verses that have been abrogated by traditions. So that's one or two types of abrogation: the abrogation of the Quran by the Quran, and the abrogation of the Quran by the tradition. But there's a third type of abrogation, which is the abrogation of the previous revelations, those given to the Jews and the Christians, collectively known as the people of the book. And this teaching conveys the idea that the revelations that have been given previously to the Jews and the Christians in the form of the Torah and the Injil were abrogated by the Quran. So now in this video I would like to provide a general introduction to this concept of abrogation, which I have been studying for some time, and I have written one or two papers on it, which may be found on academia and also on ResearchGate. Now, what brought my attention to the doctrine of abrogation was this experience of receiving conflicting messages when I was working as a lecturer and coordinator at an Islamic university in Malaysia, where on the one hand I was getting the message from my students with whom I used to discuss from time to time issues like this one. The message I was getting from them was that the Quran abrogated or cancelled the previous revelations. But the message that I was getting from the Quran, which I was reading at the time also, was that no, the Quran did not abrogate the previous revelations. On the contrary, the Quran asserts and argues that it, in fact, confirms the previous revelations. So now what's going on here? On the one hand, my students are telling me that the Quran abrogated the previous revelations. And at the same time, the Quran is telling me that no, it did not abrogate the previous revelations, but in fact, it is confirming them. So somebody didn't get it right. Now, as a Muslim, I was inclined to believe the Quran more than my students, I have to admit that. And so I did a bit more reading, and I discovered that there are at least 20 verses in the Quran, all of which say in one way or another that indeed the Quran confirms the previous revelations. In 10 of those 20 verses, the Quran in fact mentions the Torah and the Injil together in the same verse simultaneously, while in the remaining 10 verses, the Torah and the Injil are not mentioned specifically, but what is mentioned is there's an expression which is that the expression that is used in those 10 verses is that the Quran confirms what is with you already. The Arabic term for that is lima baina yadai, which means what is between your hands, literally, but actually it means what is already with you, meaning the revelations of the Torah and the Injil. Now, when I say that the Quran confirms the previous revelations, I do not mean that the Quran confirms in their entirety the written records of the previous revelations. There's a difference between a previous revelation and the written record of that revelation. There is no doubt in my mind, at least, that some degree of alteration or corruption of the previous scriptures has taken place. I had a friend from America at the University of Toronto, where I was studying political philosophy, who was enrolled in the Department of Religious Studies, and his job was, among other things, to collate approximately 600 or more different versions of the New Testament. Now, to me, that was a phenomenal task. After finishing his master's degree, he started his PhD, but I guess he couldn't see a light at the end of the tunnel, so he left and went into computer studies or something like that, and now he's active in this other area. I can't blame him for leaving that post, because how do you actually collate more than 600 different versions of the New Testament and come up with the so-called authentic, the one authentic version of the New Testament. Now, with the Quran, we do not have the same problem because most experts agree that the Quran has been preserved exceptionally well, perhaps perfectly, as some would argue, or perhaps with some very minor issues, as others would argue, but nevertheless, it seems that it has been preserved much better than records of the previous revelations. One reason for that is no doubt the form in which the Quran was revealed, which is a sort of a rhyming form. It is easier to memorize that way and also more difficult to tamper with because if you take words out and replace them with other words, that would become, I think, more obvious in a text which has been written in a verse-like manner. Another factor that sort of attests to the authenticity of the Quran is the so-called number 19 theory, with which I'm not that familiar, so I will not go into it, but I can certainly recommend that you can check out certain websites, in particular Edip Yüksel's website 19.org, where he goes into the details of this theory of the number 19, which was originally discovered by Rashad Khalifa in the United States. So now coming back to the doctrine of abrogation, I'd like to say a few words about why it is important. As you know, today we have tensions between the so-called, according to some people, the so-called clash of civilizations between Islam and the West, or Islam and the rest, as some people would say. Now, if you take the view that the Quran has abrogated the previous revelations, then I think the idea that such a conflict exists actually is reinforced by this kind of thinking. But if you take what the Quran actually itself says, that it confirms rather than abrogates the previous revelations, then I think the grounds for believing in a so-called inevitable or unavoidable clash of civilizations begins to weaken. The Quran does not have anything in principle against the previous revelations, obviously not. They are presumably also from the same God that the Muslims worship. What the Quran does is to make some corrections to some of the distortions that have apparently found their way into the understanding of the previous revelations. Now that's another topic also altogether. I would just like to mention that even in the Western tradition, there have been people who are aware that something happened in, for instance, Christianity, and that the Christianity that we have today may not necessarily be identical with the Christianity that was preached by Jesus, the Son of Mary. Among those people who have been concerned with this issue is the German philosopher George Hegel, who wrote an essay called The Positivity of the Christian Religion, in which he tried to separate what he called the positive elements of the religion, elements that were added on subsequently, from the original elements that were part of the original teaching of Jesus. Now, once again, that's not a topic I want to go into, but I would like to follow up with the idea of the clash of civilizations. So, there is no basis in the Quran for believing that there is an inevitable and unavoidable conflict between Islam and the previous religions or the previous revelations. This idea has been promoted, as you probably know, by Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. But interestingly, when we look more closely at the history of Islamic jurisprudence, we will find an idea that is remarkably similar. And this idea is based to some extent on the doctrine of abrogation. The idea I'm referring to is the notion that there is a conflict going on between the so-called Darul Islam on the one hand, the realm of peace, and the Darul Harb, or the realm of war, which is represented by all the remaining nations in the world that are not Muslim. Now, this idea of this inevitable conflict between the Darul Islam and the Darul Harb, the realm of peace and the realm of war, has no basis whatsoever in revelation in the Quran and is purely a juristic invention. It was justified by the allegation, again highly problematic, that there are some verses in the Quran which abrogated an entire range of other verses also in the Quran. The verse I'm talking about is the so-called verse of the sword, ayah as-saif, which according to the persons propagating the teaching of abrogation, abrogated up to 120 so-called peace verses also in the Quran. So now, when I read this, about this teaching, I was quite shocked because Islam is normally presented as a religion of peace. And now I am hearing from some jurists or exegete that a single verse in the Quran, verse 9:5, has abrogated 120 other verses of the Quran, all of which talk about reconciliation and peace. So what is going on? Are these people trying to tell us that a single verse has basically abrogated the teaching, the heart of the teaching of Islam, which is the teaching of peace? Are we supposed to believe this? And not only that, but there have been cases of people who have been accused of becoming apostates simply because they did not believe in one or two verses. They were accused of going out of Islam because they did not accept one or two verses in the Quran. But here, according to the exegetes supporting the theory of abrogation, we are supposed to forget about 120 verses, the peace verses, and according to them we can still remain within the fold of Islam even after we stop believing in these 120 verses. So please, help me out here, but I see a massive inconsistency here. And we need to address this inconsistency. So in the remaining videos, I will be addressing these and related issues. We will look in more detail at the doctrine of abrogation, its various manifestations, and we will also look at the contemporary juristic opinion on the issue of abrogation, which, by the way, is almost entirely against the doctrine of abrogation. Just to give a few examples, among the contemporary scholars that have unequivocally rejected the doctrine of abrogation, we find the following people. Muhammad Asad rejected the doctrine of abrogation. Muhammad Abdu rejected the doctrine of abrogation. Rashid Rida also rejected the doctrine of abrogation. Fazlur Rahman did not accept the doctrine of abrogation. Ismail Faruqi apparently did not believe in the doctrine of abrogation. Even Said Qutb apparently rejected the doctrine of abrogation. And in the older days, we have people like Abu Muslim al-Isfahani who also rejected the doctrine of abrogation. It seems to me that when you look more closely at this doctrine of abrogation, what you find is that if you believe in this doctrine and you apply it, your understanding of Islam, of revelation, will be altered in a very fundamental and significant way. Instead of a religion of peace, what you will have is a kind of rationale for waging wars of expansion to expand the realm of peace at the expense of the realm of war. And this has actually happened. The Turkish expeditions to Vienna were based on this idea that it is in fact required of Muslims to make at least one effort every year to expand the territory of Islam at the expense of the non-Muslims. But we all know, who have any familiarity with history, that these efforts by the Turkish Empire ended in disaster, and both expeditions against Vienna were defeated, and not long after that the entire Ottoman or Turkish Empire collapsed. The Quran says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not love aggressors. There is no justification whatsoever in the Quran, in the Islamic revelation, for waging any kind of war of aggression. And this is one of the lessons I think that we will need to draw from our study of abrogation. So I look forward to our next meeting, and in the meantime, I wish you all the best, and I hope that everything will go according to your hopes and expectations. And we'll see you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.